Okay. We will be talking in English. Thank you very much for coming here today. As Yali said before we started, tomorrow, this evening is the Holocaust Memorial Day, so it is kind of incidentally an opportune moment to speak about these subjects. But I think it also, the nature of the paper is such that I think it also fits well with another date that coincides, which is May 1st. I'll try to explain why that is the case, perhaps later on. Just for the start, I'd like to invite you to imagine a situation in which the rules are such that country has a death penalty, but the death penalty, when it is commissioned, it must be commissioned by whoever had meted out the death penalty. So one example that those of you who had the chance to look at the paper had encountered is the possible example of Moshe Landoi, who would be, in this case, listening to an appeal court to the Israel Supreme Court, reviewing his decision on the case with regard to Adolf Eichmann, and with the result that we all know, which is that the court upheld his death sentence. He would then have to go and commission the death sentence on his own. And I think that the intention of this paper is to say something about why such a thought experiment reveals something about the nature of criminal punishment, and in particular, the relationship between the persons and institutions that have to carry out the task of punishment, and the idea that criminal justice, and the idea of criminal justice more generally. Welcome. The paper is my little contribution to an edited volume, which is the Oxford Handbook of International Criminal Law, which is due to appear this year sometime. And it's a rereading of Hannah Arendt's classical treatment of the Eichmann case through the lens of a particular Ishko. What are we? Okay. So I said, as I said, it's a rereading of the Eichmann case. It's a reconsideration of Hannah Arendt's famous conceptualization of the case, but it's also an attempt to insert that within the context of a categorization of three kinds of critique that can be applied to law more generally. Three genres of critique, if you will, that are each identified with a theorist or a set of theorists, and each, I think, reveals in a different way the shortcomings and the limitations of law, the ways in which law can itself end up being part of a particular form of injustice. So I use the three figures that you see before you on the screen. I will start with Hannah Arendt's critique based on a concept of the rule of law. I will then talk about Shoshana Felsman's perspective, which I argue is based on an idea of law or the trial as a kind of catharsis. And I will end with Shalom Nagal, who is at the center of a film, a documentary film, that Natalie Brown had released a number of years ago. And he, I think, in his own voice and in his own words, really provides the third critical perspective, which is the contribution of this particular piece, which I conceptualize under the idea of sacrifice. And as I said, each of these genres, each of these ideas is aimed to reveal certain kinds of shortcomings of a criminal trial, and particularly with a focus on the idea of a mass atrocity trial, or a trial that really is exceptional in the sense of trying to convey a certain relationship, as I will discuss, with history. So I think maybe Arendt's view on these issues is the most familiar of the three positions that is characterized in the paper. Arendt didn't really. She ultimately supported the idea that Eichmann would be tried, of course, but she did not at all like the way that his trial was arranged in Jerusalem in the early 60s, after Eichmann was abducted from Argentina and presented before an Israeli court, an Israeli district court in Jerusalem. And her critique is, I think, generally can be identified, as I said, as a kind of articulation of basic ideas and necessary requirements of the rule of law when we think about criminal justice as a retributive apparatus that is supposed to restore justice through the idea of punishment. And I think what is not as familiar, perhaps, is that Arendt really follows very closely another legal scholar who worked in Berkeley, California at the time, Yosal Rogat, who writes a little book, and publishes it a little bit before Arendt, titled Eichmann and the Rule of Law. And in this little book, he really has, she cites him, she discusses his book, but when you go to the original, you really see that he has some of the ideas articulated very crisply, and she really follows him in many regards. And he formulates the critique of the trial based on the rule of law on three points. He has questions about the abduction of Eichmann from Argentina and the legality of that initial phase of the trial. He has important questions that, to some extent, have also arisen historically already before this, with regard to Nuremberg, about the retroactive application of law, namely the fact that at the time when Eichmann committed his crimes, there was not a clear positive prohibition of genocide, or the prohibitions that he ends up being charged with do not exist at the time and are not articulated, and this is in violation of a very, very basic principle of criminal justice and the rule of law. And he has questions that Arendt also develops about the basis of Israel's jurisdiction. The crimes are committed outside of Israel's territory. Israel does not even exist at the time when the crimes are committed, and so this seems to be a problem in terms of the basic ideas of criminal justice that need essentially to be applied in general, regardless of the identity of a particular defendant and regardless of the circumstances of a particular crime. And all of these are related in a very basic sense to the imagination that we have that criminal law can be separated from simple act of punishment, that the violence, when it's meted out by a trial, is somehow rendered different than a simple act of eye for an eye, returning violence for violence. These conditions somehow have this effect of transforming the violence into something different, and they are required in order for this transformation to occur. And Arendt indeed thinks and develops the idea that the trial, in this case, did not have that effect and was purposefully designed for other reasons that are not related to the defendant and his acts, and are not related to criminal justice, but are designed to advance altogether different social purposes that cannot legitimize the kind of state violence that was applied. Now, oftentimes we discuss this. This has been discussed in the literature as an instance of a show trial, and these drawings that were prepared for the trial in Jerusalem, that was famously, of course, had famously, of course, occurred in Beit Ha'am, in a theater that was designed to become the court, show this kind of, I think, aspect of the possibility of a show trial. Arendt is also concerned about what she calls the Oriental Mob at some point in the book, that seeks to watch this event and participate in this event, and once again conveying the event not as an instance of carrying out of justice, but as a kind of show, as a kind of theatrical event that allows participation among the popular masses, but is not about really determining guilt from innocence. And specifically, she kind of directs her attention in this regard to, sorry, I need to say differently. One aspect that she doesn't really spend a lot of time thinking about is the technical, physical, visceral aspects of carrying out the violence that is required to punish the defendant. When she does think of this aspect, she thinks of it in a way that is also has also raised some criticism that I have already hinted upon. In particular, Yu Dashan has written about this. She writes about the border, not the border guards, the police and the prison officials. Thank you. I'm doing very well. The prison guards, in particular, that they appear for her to be some kind of degraded form of existence in the trial. They speak only Hebrew and look Arabic. Some look like downright brutal types, and I think this is worthwhile to think about as I move towards my the contribution and the comments that I'd like to make on Arendt's perspective. And I think anyone who has thought about this event really has also considered a kind of implicit hierarchy that exists in the courtroom for Arendt. She thinks of the judges as a kind of embodiment of the rule of law. She's very impressed, of course, by their German language and their appearance as officers of the court. Then in the second level come Ben Gurion and Gideon Hausner, his representative in the court. They are speaking in the name of politics. They try to tell a political story of establishment of constitution of the nation state, but they are thus a little bit removed from the law and its formal requirements. And they're actually Eastern Jews, of course. They're from Poland. And third come these people who look Arabic, these prisoners who don't even speak, and we see them in the photos from the time just sitting around Eichmann and perhaps contemplating something that maybe is not related, but their role is one of execution in terms of implementing the violence. And she also has, in the end of the book, she gives a little bit of attention to the scene of execution itself, when Eichmann is really standing before the death sentence and is about to be hanged. And she tells the story about how he has this speech before he goes to be hanged, and it's a dramatic speech about and it has to do with the story of someone who really separates from history and from the world. He says, "After a short while, gentlemen, we shall meet again. Such is the fate of all men. Long live Germany, long live Austria, long live Argentina. I shall not forget them. And of course, it's described in a silly way and in an ironic way. And he seems to be, as he is across the whole book, a kind of idiot, speaking in an overly dramatic tone. But still, the situation has a kind of gripping effect of standing before death. And so all this together, I think, is enough, even though there's a lot more, obviously, to talk about here, to, I think, describe to you the general aspects of this as a criticism of international criminal law. International criminal law diverts and is not the same as criminal law more generally. It tries to do something completely different, and it's really just taking the violence of law and in order to make a historical, social, political position, but not in order to assert criminal justice before the individuals. It's not about the accused, as Arendt oftentimes says again and again in the book. And so we see this kind of critique appearing in the scholarship long after, and of course to this day, and to some extent it has become, it does have its own, I think, slight flavor of something that has become a little bit banal in and of itself. But this is from Malki Koskiniemi, who's, of course, a very important international criminal law scholar, who I think echoes this critique and also cites this critique in a famous article of his on international criminal law as a show trial. And he writes that international criminal law oscillates ambivalently between the wish to punish those individually responsible for large humanitarian disasters and the danger of becoming a show trial. So the critique, in other words, is with us till this day. We hear it often, and it's a kind of genre.
It's interesting that he uses the word large humanitarian disasters and not really the right description.
I don't know if it's the right description or not, but I think it's definitely a description that's trying to be normatively agnostic. That is, not to take a position a priori about what happened in a particular historical moment.
What year does he?
2005. This is articles from 2005. So with that, I think we are ready to pass into a kind of a totally different line of criticism. A totally different line of criticism, indeed, that I think is characterized by precisely embracing those parts of the aspect of the show trial of the Eichmann event that so bothered Arendt, and saying this is precisely what criminal law should be about. You're entirely wrong. You put a show a mass atrocity trial is different from a normal trial, and it is about healing and constructing a community. And we need to think about it in that way in order to carry it out in a correct. And this, I think, is represented by Shoshana Feldman, but by many others by now. As I said, it's a trope. It's something that we have with us in the literature and comes up in many cases. And I bring Arendt, I bring Feldman because she articulates, I think, in the most explicit way, the psychoanalytic and kind of, I think, issues that have to do with a deep therapeutic aspect that this kind of discourse tries to bring to a trial. But before Feldman, just like Rogat spoke before Arendt, Susan Sontag, the critic, already articulates the assumptions of this second point of view. And I'm going to read just an excerpt from Susan Sontag that is published quite early. As Hannah Arendt and others have pointed out, the juridical basis of the Eichmann trial, the relevance of all the evidence presented, and the legitimacy of certain procedures are open to question on strict legal grounds. But the truth is that the Eichmann trial not only did not, but could not have conformed to legal standards only. The function of the trial was like that of the tragic drama, above and beyond judgment and punishment, catharsis, namely a kind of cleansing and of the self and of the community in order to be able to function and heal from deep tragic wounds. Now, one of the figures that is most ridiculed, alongside Eichmann himself by Arendt, is of course the author Kazetnik, who is really the embodiment of the silliness of just telling the stories and bringing the evidence that has nothing to do with the particular crimes of the accused. And Feldman, of course, cashes in on that moment by saying that Kazetnik now becomes her hero, because if this trial is about healing of wounds, it is not only it's necessary, and it's precisely what it is about, to hear the point of view of the victim and let them somehow appear in a way that will, for the first time, allow their point of view, their subjective point of view, that may have not been, probably did not have a place in the public sphere before the trial, be articulated and find its own language. And that language for Feldman is not even a verbal language. It's the language of saying all that he has to say, but then really collapsing. So the collapsing moment that we know about in this event is a moment of exposure in which a truth becomes public, and it's possible to acknowledge it now, and it's possible to live with it now. It constructs the Israeli community as it is. And it's a legal failure, but the legal failure is precisely the success of the mass atrocity trial. Now, of course, Kazetnik is only one example among many. This is also before the trial, and you see a completely different positionality just in the body and the figure here speaking before the court. But I think Feldman, who thinks of herself as a feminist writer and a feminist critic, is much more interested in not in this kind of straight stature, but really in the moments of collapse and unfolding of a truth that cannot be said in words. And I want to emphasize again here that what I already said, that this position is not particular to her. And there is a really great body of literature that develops this and makes this in international criminal law the basis for a few big ideas about what international criminal trials should be. So I think the literature here can be categorized into three groups. One group is about the victim rights and about the point of view of the victim that I already somehow developed here, but the idea that it's not only a trial in which an authority, a government authority, charges an individual and the victims come as providers of evidence. No, it's about letting them speak, it's about hearing them as well, and it changes the structure of the traditional adversary procedure. Another kind of discourse that comes out of this writing is the very developed discourse about transitional justice that we identify with authors today like Untitled, but others. And the idea here is a certain kind of relationship between criminal law and history. Criminal law is a moment in which history can be judged as a whole, the narrative can be rewritten and reconstructed, and the community can have a story that it can live by and that can carry it forward in a way that it becomes cogent, it becomes functional, and it's able to live with all its different parts and traumas. And a third idea that also is somehow now, in textbooks, the basic idea of international criminal law is this idea of creating a record of history. So this seems to be similar to the idea of transitional justice, but it's not exactly the same. The idea here is, the emphasis here is more on the fact that the evidence will not only be taken, but also written down, will become available and accessible to the wide public. The record becomes a kind of record that is supposed to ascertain not only the crimes, but indeed what has happened in a particularly dark moment in human history. And all of this, I think, is, we also see these things in just regular criminal law to some extent. As those of you who have thought about criminal law here know, but they get a particularly dramatic and central aspect when we talk about mass atrocity trials in the discourse of international criminal law that has developed in particular since the 1990s, in the previous decade, and now seems to be still somehow around, even if not, maybe not in its high time anymore. And here I reach the point where I want to kind of make the contribution of this particular intervention beyond just talking about stuff that is already kind of familiar to people who are in this field, and I think is somehow familiar to everyone who is living in our world today, politically. And it's the genre of sacrifice. I talked about 2015. So you see Nagal in one of the posters belonging to the film. He's a butcher working in Cholon, and throughout the film, most of the time he spends talking while carrying out his work, while butchering animals for food or for sacrificial and ceremonial reasons. And he tells the story throughout the film about the way that he was chosen to execute Eichmann, to be the one who will carry out the sentence. And it quickly, this is an enormously dramatic moment in his life, an enormously defining moment in his life that I think ultimately, when we really articulate all the underlying assumptions, sheds a very grim and disturbing light on the two other perspectives, the rule of law perspective and the catharsis perspective. Shalom Nagal essentially was traumatized by carrying out the sentence. He tells the story of how he was chosen to hang Eichmann. He put him on he put the noose around his neck. Eichmann kind of spit blood, and he had to take him off after he was dead and put the body away. Coming back home, he was extremely disturbed. He suffered directly from trauma after this event, losing sleep at night, having recurring nightmares, just experiencing a constant sense of fear and discomfort. And the thing that really helped him kind of overcome this is turning to religion. And he became a kosher butcher as a profession only after this. He was a prison guard before that. He was one of these people that Arendt identifies and thinks of as these kind of people who speak only Hebrew, etc. And this is not only a trauma that is based on having to deal with killing a person. It's also a trauma that has to do with the reasons for the violence being allocated in terms of the social labor of punishment on him in particular. Because, as he tells the story, it becomes entirely clear that he was chosen because of his background, his ethnic background, his personal background, especially being a Jew from a non-European country. He's a Yemenite Jew. And he explains this not only as a matter of discrimination, it's actually a different thing, because in his account, everyone wanted to carry out the sentence. It was not something that was considered to be an undesirable task. Indeed, he was the only one who did not want to carry out the sentence. But because of the conditions that require us to separate between punishment and revenge, it was important that someone be chosen that had no relationship to the underlying crimes. It needs to be a dispassionate performance of violence that is not related to a biographical, personal act of revenge. And indeed, at the time, it was very much considered that survivors might come and take revenge, and he was supposed to guard the defendant against the survivors so that the trial can reach its conclusion. Empowered member of the society, and it's given with an implicit acknowledgement. You're not truly a member of our community. Your membership rests on your biographic detachment from our founding trauma. If we think of this,
you can read it as a Kantian move, not as a political social move.
Well, we will discuss this very soon, and I have something to say about that. But let's talk about it. I'll just leave it right now because it's a big open issue. But yes, I think the Kantian move is just to say very concisely. I think the Kantian move is the Arendtian move, the separation between punishment and violence, and the material social move is the third point of critique. These are two different genres of critique. So this comes as a critique of the Kantian move. It says every application of the rule of law will come in a particular context in which there will be a reason why particular actors will be considered to be far enough from the relevant questions in order to be allocated the violence that needs to be allocated, that needs to be carried out. And indeed, taking that role has a certain price that will be inflicted upon particular members and not others in the context of punishment.
All the other candidates for hanging were not very much similar to this guy, detached from the crime.
Well,
because you assume that all the other candidates were.
I do not assume anything, and
this is exactly the opposite.
Let me answer to you very directly. Your point reconfirms and strengthens the critique that I conveyed, because indeed he says that every member of the group was not from a European background, but the only person from a European background was this Merchavi, and they were indeed subordinated to him in the context of carrying out the sentence. So particular roles, and this is not only with regard to Second World War crimes, this is a general attempt to present a criticism of criminal law. Particular roles are given to particular people according to their social status. And this is something that within the context of criminal law, we just don't tend to think about. We tend to occlude, we tend to be blind to it. And really, Nagal is very upset by this. He's really angry, and he's not an angry character in the film. And if you happen to see the film, you'll see that he's a guy with a lot of humor, and he laughs a lot during the film and when he tells these stories. But you see that he's actually also very angry, and he's angry because he thinks that this is a kind of violence that was inflicted upon him. He thinks that the system was willing to pay the price of losing him in order to perform this kind of act of historical justice. If we lose one Yemenite, he says, it's no great loss. Many Yemenites died, so another will die. But this Eichmann, it was a problem because it was a world trial. So this is a translation from the Hebrew, of course, but mishpat olami is the words that he uses. But the point of view here is one about the fact that there's a kind of large historical justice or project of historical justice taking place, and these particular individuals were not in an advantaged place in their respective societies, are sacrificed in this determination to carry out historical justice. Now, I want to, as I said, expand this and not only talk about the Israeli context. This is really an attempt to say something general about criminal law. And as I said, and as Chaim helped me articulate, it's really a criticism based on class and based on race in terms of who ends up paying the price of the violence that needs to be carried out in order to punish. And we can think about prison guards in general. It doesn't have to be someone who executes it. It doesn't really need to be in the context of capital punishment alone, and their role. Law and society scholars have often described and discussed this idea that the defendants are often from disadvantaged groups in society. So I think the classical law and society criticism of criminal justice is that criminal justice is really an attempt to protect property. And because it is an attempt to protect property, it will systematically end up trying in the greatest numbers those people who are property-less. That's the kind of Marxist criticism of criminal law. This is a different kind of criticism. It doesn't focus on the defendant. It focuses on that class of people who are supposed to carry out the violence of criminal law. The prison guards, the policemen, the border guards that systematically pay a price for having the rule of law that is not articulated and not really thought of, I think, within the context of the scholarship about the critical scholarship about criminal law. But people who have thought about this a little bit are NGOs writing about prisoner rights, for example. So for them, it's very clear that when prisoner guards are angry and when prisoner guards are subordinated and exploited, the prisoners will end up paying the price. So they want to protect the prison guards as well. So Penal Reform International, for example, says in one of its reports that prison guards' work often goes unrecognized despite the vital role of prison staff in the achievement of the aims of criminal justice, notably the rehabilitation of offenders, as well as in the meeting of prison standards. So this is just one example of this larger question. And to explain it once again in different words, the sacrificed hangman is exposed to a kind of moral harm because he or she belongs to a group that suffers from structural discrimination. But this harm comes to appear as part of an attempt to ensure a fair and objective process. It becomes invisible because it is thought of as a necessity of the legitimate rule of law and political goals of the trial. It's not just that a particular class is given this role. Giving this role to a particular class is a way of constructing a kind of distance, as I said, between the event that is tried and the act of punishment, ultimately. Now, towards the end of the paper, towards the end of the discussion, I tried to raise the question of, to broaden a little bit the social context in which we think of these issues. And interestingly, in the film, we end up discovering that Shalom Nagal was not only a prison guard for Eichmann, he also served in Hebron in a prison guard as a prison guard for Palestinian prisoners in a later period in his life. And there he talks about his encounter as something that re-traumatized him with the cries of and shouts of Palestinians who have violence inflicted against them in detention. And this is in a part of the conversation which tries to shed light on the parts of the relevant society that don't even have representation at all in this story. So one, arguably, is in terms of who paid the price for the story of a reestablishment of a community after an enormous trauma, is, I think, a non-Jewish people who live in this part of the world. And they're just inserted, by the way, in the end, through the witnessing of Shalom Nagal. And I think it's worthwhile to just highlight the irony of the fact that Moshe Landauer,
It's Landau, but
Landau.
everywhere it's,
Landau, but
yeah, okay, never mind. He did not only sit in the Eichmann trial, he ended up, of course, writing the famous or infamous report about allowing for moderate physical pressure on detainees. And here again, we see these two people witnessing the same events from different points of view, from different roles, where the price of the violence is systematically ends up being rolled or being carried by one of them, while the other is kind of carrying out office in the name of a kind of rule of law position. So just to, and before that, there's also, I think, some things to be said about the sacrificed animals, the animals that Nagal himself, kills throughout the film time and time again, and their positionality in this entire story. And maybe just not to be too long, that's something that can also come up in maybe in the question and answer period. But I just want to conclude at this point by really highlighting the ways in which this third methodology of critique sheds a different light on the first two that I described here. So I think with regard to Arendt, I already said a few, with regard more importantly to the rule of law critique, I already said a few words, but essentially the move is to say that the rule of law is not something that can be applied without a social context. It's not something that can be a one-size-fits-all kind of formula. And the trial, when it happens within a particular social context that is part of thinking of it as in terms of justice. And we cannot really externalize these identitarian and cultural and also class-based aspects when we think about justice. So it's really, that's why I said in the beginning that I think this is also a good talk for May 1st. The second critique towards Feldman is really revealing who pays for this catharsis. And now I don't want to position myself in the final moment as saying that the trial was not important in terms of the social role that it played in this country, and in terms of precisely the kind of things that Feldman thinks about and talks about in her work, a kind of social process of healing. But it also, I think, in the same way, needs to be really articulated and thought about clearly that when we put together such a theater, some people will be behind the scenes pulling ropes, some people will be on the stage, and these different kinds of roles will have different kinds of effects, different kinds of prices that different actors will play, and ultimately there is a form of a kind of price that we don't end up often thinking about, which is a political and a cultural and also a mental price that is really, I think, embodied by this particular figure, and is a kind of hidden legacy of critique that exists in the trial. Ready?
Thanks, Itamar. It's really a fascinating paper, and
We can do it in Hebrew and English.
English.
We have a member that
so really, I'm thinking about the paper for a couple of days now, and I think that this is like, good critical work. It's work through, making you feel uncomfortable. So my questions relate to this, and I have one question about the first part of the first two genres of critique, and then maybe two or three regarding the opposition. So first, I think that something that is another way to portray maybe the tension between the first and the second critiques is regarding who owns international criminal law, right? Is it a universal project or a project of the affected community? And I think that the catharsis movement is also very much related to the role of the affected community. And if we think about the Eichmann trial, so whether Israel has the obligation and right and maybe a justification to try in or a universal court, and I think that it's something that is extremely significant in international criminal law, and it also very much follows these two types of critique. And regarding your contribution, I have maybe several concerns regarding whether it really captures what's going on. So first, I think that in contrast to the first two, this is actually a general critique of criminal law that is not especially related to mass atrocities. Right? If we think about the catharsis as something that is extremely important for society, or the rule of law and politics as it plays in international law, the role of the executioner does not seem to me as something that is unique to international criminal law. And maybe even it's less, I would say, harmful in this case. Since you explained, right, people wanted to execute Eichmann, I'm not sure whether it's true regarding any offender generally, or maybe the harm, I'm not a psychologist, but maybe the harm is more limited when it's like Hitler type of guys. So this is the first thing. The second is you look at this group as Nagar, maybe the prison guards more generally, and they definitely, we can assume that they relate to a class or race or something. But I would think that this harm applies to all participants in this endeavor. So the Mossad members who captured Eichmann in Argentina, the judges. So I have a story in my family.
Why do you say that? It's not the same.
It's not the same.
Mossad people became heroes, and Gardner became
Actually, FDA Tan's last interview, he kind of epitomized Feldman's, how this was the thing that was so important in his life.
The judges lives in Bet Hakerem, and this guy is living in Bat Yam,
Okay, but the question is, how is it relevant to the task with respect to criminal law? So I don't know. When I entered the court and I sat in a criminal trial and we worked on a case that I definitely paid the price by, being exposure or having the duty to decide the fate of a person. I think that you clearly can envision the trauma that judges, lawyers, and so on have through being a part of this process. So clearly the executioner is perhaps the best example of this price. But if Itamar includes the prison guards that does not execute, we can think that this chain has many members that does not necessarily belong to a specific class.
Is it a direct line, or does it transverse into the other side? Because it shouldn't be that.
Okay, so and in this regard, I think that, again, specifically when it's like national endeavors, I'm not sure that it always follows the race and class. So if we think about Yefei Ablorit Ve'Atoar, for example, as a concept, they were part of the strong, at least, right, the more established parts of the society, and they were, suffered the price of being part of a war or whatever. Like they were the executioners in other tasks. So I'm not sure that it's clearly follows this logic. And relatedly, I think that the modern story that we hear about the social role of the Eichmann trial in the Israeli society was to empower the disempowered, right?
Of course.
There were the Sabars and there were the disempowered survivors.
That's absolutely right.
And if this is the story, so it's not only about the role of the disempowered, but also empowering role within the society. And in this sense, I'm not sure that the specific example of Nagar tells us necessarily a story about like whether the Mizrahi Jews were part or were not part of this empowering moment or like social cohesion, or to what extent was it important or not important for their own story. Especially if his story is right, that his fellow prison guards wanted to take part of it, and most of them were Mizrahi Jews. So, and thanks again.
Okay. So I think that these are all very, very good points. I'll just take them in order and say a few words about each one, but shortly so that we can. Regard to universal versus the affected community, I think this is a central issue, and it's central issue to, as you say, exactly as you say, to distinguish between the first and the second genres. So the first genre, Hannah Arendt, she wants the trial, but she wants the international community to carry out the trial. Martin Buber wants the international community to carry out the trial. They don't want it to be in the context of Israeli society because they're afraid precisely of this dynamic of a show trial and of revenge and etc. It's not really the rule of law. And on the other hand, Feldman, but Feldman is not the most important person here. I mean, so many writers, different writers have really emphasized the important healing effect or the important social effect that really this needs to be part of the community. And Lior Abilski, for example, who is written about this in Tel Aviv University, really writes about the Eichmann trial as a paradigm of a communitarian justice. So justice is not something that is coming from some kind of God's eye view. It has to be participatory. And in order for it to be participatory, the condition is a local aspect, a domestic aspect, and it's against the project of international criminal law as a project of universality per se. And as you know very well, this is a discussion that continues throughout the history of international criminal law, with the context of the ad hoc tribunals, with the context of the mixed tribunals of various kinds, hybrid tribunals, etc. Always, this is a leading dilemma about how to compose. So it's just one articulation here. Is it unique to international law? So I think that you're right here. In the sense that really, essentially, this is has to be about criminal law more generally. It doesn't need to be about the international criminal law or mass atrocity trials in particular. There is this added form of drama, but it's really not, in some ways, just a trial, some kind of, I don't know, you can think about Zadorov or whatever. I mean, just a completely ordinary criminal trial has all these aspects as well. I think that what's interesting about international criminal law, and I don't think that I did a good job in the paper in fully capturing this, is, in The Hague, there is a prison. It's one of the best prisons in the world, reportedly, in terms of conditions. And in general, I think probably in terms of the conditions of the prison guards as well, it's not these are not people who are being systematically sacrificed when we look at the global.
It's not Yemenite, it's Dutch. So that's the difference.
No, yes.
Dutch hooligans, maybe.
Maybe. But in international criminal law, what we don't see and what is really the chain of enforcement mechanisms that exist and don't exist in other places in the world. They're completely out of our sight. We just don't see them. If there is an international arrest, it really is based on an enormous institutional apparatus that we really don't know how to think about. And that maybe is the special aspect. We don't even know where the price is paid in international criminal law. In terms of Mossad members and judges, I will take that question together with your question about soldiers and Yofei Abloit and all that. I think they're related. So I think that there's really two interesting aspects here that concern immunity, legal doctrines of immunity. And we need to compare here judges, as you say, and soldiers with police officers, paradigmatically. So I think there is this famous book by James Whitman about the origins of the origins of the reasonable doubt in international criminal law. In his view, the reasonable doubt idea, the idea that you cannot convict a criminal unless you prove you prove that he's guilty beyond reasonable doubt, is based on a protection for the judges. So it's a protection for their conscience, and it's a protection for the fact that after they die, they need to go to heaven. They need to be protected from hell. So they need not be in the position of sin. So there is a kind of built-in protection here that applies. And in the context of soldiers, we also know that there is a legal authorization to kill other soldiers. There is a kind of immunity for combatants that applies. So the law knows how to protect particular classes of people that then become heroes of a system. But the law less knows and less thinks about how to protect the executioner class, the class that is implementing the just regular, ordinary workings of criminal law, which I think of as policemen and prisoner guards paradigmatically. So that's the basis of my answer, but we could speak about this more. Regarding the disempowerment of the survivors and the Mizrahis who were also a kind of audience to this trial, your last point, I think that's very, very important. I think that really the disempowered survivors is the point that Feynman comes out of, and other writers have also written about this, and it's also related to somehow to class and surely to ethnic origin. It's about the German Jews who came here and were not part of this society originally, and and their story was not told originally, and they were, as you say, somehow humiliated by the stronger generation of people who established the country. And here, all of a sudden, their story becomes public and is accepted into the general narrative of this state. And I think that's really crucial. It's correct, and it's a major aspect of the second catharsis genre. It appears in writing about survivors in general and about witnessing in general after World War II. In terms of the audience that is not European, it's clear from documents during the time and also from Arendt's book that they are considered in this event, but they're considered in the position of a population that needs to be educated. They don't know about these events, and so we have an educational role to inform them and to let them know what happened. And so there is a kind of social pedagogical aspect that appears with regard to those people that is also interesting. And of course, I could say more, but we'll try to.
I just have a question. Can you just very succinctly give the conceptual difference that you talked about, very different between international criminal law and criminal law? Just in a couple of sentences.
I'll give
I know.
It'll give me a break because he's a
No, just
no.
yeah. Just a couple of sentences.
International criminal law is a discipline of international law that is supposed to try and to assert criminal accountability for criminals accused of a particular category of heinous crimes, normally considered to be war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. And it's oftentimes based on customary international law. It goes beyond borders, and the jurisdiction is considered to be universal somehow.
So why is that conceptually so different from a criminal trial?
Because in a criminal trial, normally
Terrible. I
use the category of mass atrocity trials in the paper, which is somehow murky. It's somehow just really serious crimes or something
serial
like that.
killer, a criminal.
How is that conceptually different?
Yes, of a criminal trial of a serial killer in a certain country who's killed, dozens of people.
I think just to take really the most formal legal answer, this defendant will be tried according to the law of that country.
Right.
And he will be sentenced according to the procedures of that particular country. Both the enforcement authorities and the judiciary will have particularly limited jurisdiction, and I think so. That's
So
essentially the difference.
okay,
It's
so,
also historically different.
conceptually, it's not that
Before
different.
the 20th of the 20th century, there was no international law.
Right,
So
no,
also historical, and contextual, and cultural.
I
difference.
understand that I understand, but you had one sentence where they're very different conceptually at the beginning. And I just wanted to see what I
The
was
general
missing.
move that this essay and article makes is to talk about mass atrocity trials, namely
Right.
trials that are particularly for heinous crimes and have this kind of exceptional
Right.
historical atmosphere around them. And they can be domestic or international, really.
So in the, okay, that was just a,
Just first of all, a small correction about your answer to Yali about the German Jews. You know, it's not the catharsis of the German Jews here, the trial. It's the victims of the Holocaust, and the German Jews that we are talking about, Landau and Czarszewski and others, came here already in the 20s, and they were actually, although they were laughed upon, they were part of the elite and actually had a very, very
It's the other
important
side
role
of my
in
family. Saying it's the other side of my family who came after.
Yeah, so I'm saying it's not the catharsis of the German Jews. But I must say that it's interesting, all these three accounts are interesting, but I found them not less manipulative, okay, than what they comment on. Because as I said, you know, if you look at this quotation of this, I don't remember his name, the modern guy who wrote about the International Court of Justice, you know,
Castagnani.
yeah, describing these mass murders or mass atrocity as responsible for large humanitarian disasters. What do you mean? What we understand by large responsibility for large humanitarian disaster? Is the prime minister who didn't act in time to prevent causes of an earthquake or a tsunami, but this is really manipulative language. But I think the essence here, with regard to some of these observations, are that you presented it as explicit or implicit dichotomy between justice and rule of law on one side and show trial on the other side. And I don't think that this is a dichotomy. You know, you have show trials which actually are making justice, and you have show trials which are very different. You know? So comparing the Jewish doctor's trial in Moscow to Eichmann's trial is, you know, it's not so easy to compare. And you have show trials that are show trials, not because of special procedure, not because of abduction, but because there is an interest. You know, dairy trial can be also a show trial, and the verdict was transmitted live on radio. Now, if you think about the Manuk, this is a very interesting example, because the Manuk construction of trial was very much similar to Eichmann. It was not in a regular court, it was in a hall, it was broadcast as live, and what happened? It was acquitted. So I think that this is a dangerous thing to say that every show trial or every trial that is used either deliberately or not deliberately for educational purposes, for catharsis, for is injustice and against the rule of law, taking into account the fact that I think that in Eichmann's case there are problems with the abduction and the retroactivity and all these issues, but I don't think that every show trial is by definition injustice or against the rule of law. And you know, if you take the trials in the Hague, there are show trials, okay? But I don't think that they deny justice. On the contrary, you say that, you know, this is one criticism from the other side, that these criminals, that if they would have been tried in their own country under their own jurisdiction, this Serbian, what's his name?
Milosevic.
Milosevic. The mob would have probably
Gaddafi.
or tear them to pieces, and this guy gets 5 stars accommodation in Dutch prison. And that's a different perspective that you can come up with about making, it's in not making justice, but exactly opposite from the claims that are made by the 3 people. And again, with regard to Nagar, I really don't understand the criticism, because it's not that he was connected. You said before that he was the only one who said that he doesn't want to hang. It's not the other one, that all the other people, all of them, were not really personally connected, first degree to the Holocaust. And to choose the one who doesn't want to hang, can also explain it very differently. So I must say that I relate to all the 3 strands of literature as manipulative, not less than what they want to criticize.
Okay. I think that you raised a number of points, and I'll start with what I take to be the most general point, which is that show trials can sometimes not only meet the conditions of the rule of law, but also be socially beneficial. I think that's rephrasing your general point. So I think that the fact that they can meet the conditions of the rule of law is clear, and they can still become very publicly, even a kind of spectacle. Even if they meet the conditions of the rule of law, we have many, many examples in Israel and also abroad. O.J. Simpson. I mean, we have so many examples. So I think that's just, I'm just going to accept that. What I think is the more important point is really relates to Judith Shklar's work on show trials with regard to Nuremberg. Going back to that, Nuremberg trials also have this problem famously have this problem of retroactivity, and in Shklar's book, she discusses the way that, in fact, there was no legal formal way to overcome this problem, and that the prosecutors knew it at the time, and they were just fudging by saying that there is a way under customary international law to really meet the condition of nullum crimen sine lege. And nevertheless, she defends the trial. Why? Because it was socially beneficial on a global stage. It had a good effect in the world. It was justified in a completely consequentialist argument, and not in an argument that is based on the rule of law for Shklar. And I think that is the more challenging position. The position where there is a socially beneficial project that is nevertheless in direct violation of rule of law principles.
Unless you believe in natural law, and then you can also incorporate.
But I don't.
Okay, you do.
No, I mean,
Okay.
Natural law.
Okay.
I mean, criminal law was never, arguably, even for the natural lawyers, there's a natural law condition that the law is articulated. For Lon Fuller, for example, it's a natural law gives a justification for the law to be articulated, to be expressed and positive. So I think that even in the natural law position, it's not that easy actually. But that I think is the challenging position that I think that really also appears in the Eichmann trial, and there you're kind of pressed to take a position whether you are willing to go with that. This paper is not about that, but I think it's a really challenging. It's indeed a really challenging question, but it does relate to your idea about the dichotomy, about the idea that there is no dichotomy. And I think here, once again, I need to kind of accept your position and also say that according to at least one of the views, Feldman's view, there is no dichotomy. She doesn't see this as a dichotomy. She sees the show aspect as really part of what the trial is all about. Finally, just regarding your last point, you said, you think all three perspectives are manipulative. Here, I don't know what to say really, because at least two perspectives, those that are not mine, are very well established in literature, and so I don't feel a need to justify them. And I think that in terms of the third perspective that I add to the picture, there is I spoke with the director of the film, and there is a lack of clarity regarding the facts, how exactly he was chosen. He tells a particular story, others have told a little bit of a different story, but I'm willing to assume some of these facts in order to articulate a more conceptual and general idea that I think is still valuable. But you're free not to think so.
It wouldn't make any change with anyone with the other gods.
Yes, I don't think I need to go into
It's the same class and same ethnicity.
Thank you. I'm not from the crime and the law, but I have a lot of things that I will try to make it short. So first of all, generally speaking about your paper, I think that methodologically there is a big gap between the first two and the third one. I think that philosophically speaking, or even methodological speaking, I didn't see the real critic idea between the third one and the first two, because the first two are very weak from your point of view. And I didn't see why the film and the idea of this perpetuator destroy or attack the ideas or the position of Hannah Arendt and Shoshana Feldman. And more that, I think that the third part of you is very original and very interesting. You didn't develop the interest for the crime or for the law of crime within this third part, because I didn't understand where does it, what does it make, why there it will be more easier or simpler to understand where we have or where we can to take somebody like Eichmann to trial, which is the main problem. Where to take this guy after Germany is no more there, is a citizen or a citizen of Argentina, where the Jews they're not there anymore because they were executed. So where is the arena, where is the place that we can take this guy into justice? And I can say that I think that why it is very interesting, because you're raising the whole question, which I think now is very prominent, about the idea of perpetrators, which I think now it's much more important than the idea of this Eichmann who committed crime, like as we are, as Israeli, as we are, I mean, peace members, we are perpetrators of this Israel crime of kibush, of Palestinian atrocity, and so on and so forth. And I think that nowadays law doesn't treat and doesn't have any tools in order to understand or to modify my position. I know, as you know, that I have to be tried. I know I'm saying it and I'm putting it in my Facebook and everything. But is there any law that can try me? No. And that's why, I mean, why you spoke about the prisoners and the judges, I think it is right, but on another side. Not because they were chosen by the hegemonic, by the ruler to execute Eichmann, but because we are all perpetrators of this crime together with this Talian. We are not outside of the effect. We are with him at the point where he did executed Eichmann. But we are going home and sleep well, because we are Smolani, we are good people, and he's the bad guy. So I think this is very interesting, and this was my first point, that I think that for your paper, the third part, which is much more important, is not developed on the right methodologically, which is the idea of what kind of ideas or law we now are thinking about all those perpetrators, which are more than this poor guy. And on the other side, why I like this third part, because on the third part, you're not dealing with text, you're not dealing with law book, but you're dealing with a film, with a cinema. And we're dealing with cinema and dealing with Hofar, with phenomena. I think that you have to introduce this big discussion between Lanzmann, Godard, and Didier, which was this go-on discussion since the beginning of Shoah, which was, I think, 1984. And the big idea of the Shoah was, how can we show, talk, listen, hear, learn from something which is on the screen? And as Lanzmann said, one picture of the Shoah, instead of speaking for the Shoah, cover all what happened in the Shoah because we have a picture. And I would think that the picture is the reality. And I think this discussion, I can go on with it, but this is very interesting. Because Godard said that, cinema, photography, human activity, they betrayed the human kind in the Shoah. He said that, and since then there is no cinema. For Godard, there is no cinema. It's only a girl with a gun. Since 45 is a girl with a gun. So this film is a part of the girl with the gun. It's not a part of what cinema should do if it were right in what he was doing in the Shoah. So I think for the third part, you have really to introduce this very interesting discussion, which is really.
Who is this third one?
Didier Berman, Georges Didier Berman. He wrote a very nice book that was just translated to Hebrew, Image Malgré Tout, Dimuim Lamrot Hakol, which is a book that he published at the end of the last century, and it is about, an answer to Claude Lanzmann about 6 pictures that one of the guys of Sonderkommando did in Birkenau. And it was kept in a קופסה של משחת שיניים for 40 years, and somebody discovered it and developed. And it's the only 6 pictures that you see the execution. You see a lot of gufot, you see the place, and you see the executors. And Didier Berman wrote a book, now it's translated into Hebrew. Even today, this evening, there is an event in Tolat Sorim, Tel Aviv about this book. Wonderful book. So Didier Berman has image, malgré tout, image, למרות הכל. Lanzmann said, no image. For the Shoah, we can't have an image. We have to, all his film is about talking about what happened, which Naga is following Lanzmann. Because Naga is doing the same thing that Lanzmann. So your discussion should put Naga with Lanzmann and talk about Godard and Didier and develop this time, but vis-a-vis law, because Lanzmann and Didier Berman, they don't talk at all about the law. And one last point, because I have a lot of other points, is about this kind of היעדר חפץ עניין. Because I think this relationship between aesthetics and law that we're talking about is the middle, and the central is the way that they choose this guy. That is under the Kantian aesthetics. The first idea of aesthetics is that the best aesthetic catharsis is a picture that has no חפץ עניין. And this guy had no חפץ עניין in Eichmann. So for Kant, is really the climax of moral. Act. You see? So I think you can develop through this way much more interesting position against Hannah Arendt and Shoshana Feldman. I think the idea of catharsis is very weak. So, okay.
Okay.
I was understood.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I'll also respond to
The catharsis is an interesting issue. Was there catharsis really? How do you measure catharsis? He was not.
No, catharsis is an Aristotelian idea. And for him, in the catharsis, the actor doesn't die at the end of the catharsis is a simulacrum. And Shoshana Feldman is talking about the catharsis on behalf of somebody that died at the end. It can't be a catharsis.
No, survivors.
Yeah.
He said,
Survival.
No, but-
The survivors.
No, but
the end of the Eichmann thing.
Well, the
Also
catharsis is for the survivors as well.
no, but the actors. The
Ah.
fact is, the actors stay alive, and the catharsis is taking into consideration that is one society which has something together. And in the Eichmann, you said that the society, Israeli society, is not like a Athenian society of aristocrat people. I mean, we are not at the same community.
But it's also
We
interesting.
are much more multi.
It's also interesting that Eichmann was not hanged in the public. The end of the affair is that we wake up in the morning and hear in the radio that he was hanged
So
last
it's
night.
another
So
aesthetic
it's
event.
not really, it's anti-catharsis or anti-climate. So.
No, but the conditions of catharsis are that the violence is concealed. That's part of my criticism. That the fact that we don't see that is really part of what allows us to think, like I think Shoshana Feldman thinks, that the violence was just a marginal part of this whole story. Really what it was about is about the stories that people told. It's not about the fact that someone was hanged. Okay, someone was hanged in the end, but that's not what it's really
No,
about.
but had he been hanged in the middle of the town square in front of the television screen,
We wouldn't be able to
you would-
ignore the fact that he's hanged.
No, but you would criticize it as.
That's why I start with this idea that the judge should, this thought experiment, that the judge would actually, carry out the whole thing on their own.
Yes, but I want to read once more the beginning of the Discipline and Punish.
Mm.
You remember the
Yes.
beginning?
Yes, I
So
do.
this is a public catharsis.
No, but in a totally different regime of sense, in a totally different time. We're talking about the 20th century. We're talking about a human rights context.
But in 20th century, we are not one community. We are
That's right.
multiple, so we can't have a catharsis.
Anyways, I want to a little bit
Yeah.
post order on the conversation, and just I want to say only one very simple thing about your comments that are very interesting, which is that you say that the two first positions are very weak. I actually do not think that they're very weak. Maybe I presented them as too weak in this context, and then if I did that, I gave myself an easy job, because then it seems like the position that I developed is like all the stronger, because I have just two weak positions to deal with. But I actually think that they're very, very strong positions: the rule of law position and the catharsis position, or the catharsis position. Maybe we shouldn't call it that way, but the position that is based on a kind of communitarian form of justice that wants to provide a kind of story for the community. I think both of these stories are extremely strong, and the reason, and ultimately, frankly speaking, and this is maybe my limitation, I can't find myself squarely in one position or the other. I feel that a pluralist position is always very uninteresting. You say, I think this one is right, and this one is right, and this one is right as well, but I can't but find myself somehow in that position. I'm torn between them all. I feel strengths of all these positions, and so I may have underplayed the two first positions if I just sold them too cheaply. And with regard to the forum, that it relates to this problem. So I think the modest corrective, ultimately, I think that I think the forum was the correct forum, but it should have been thought of in a fuller way. And I think we generally need to think in a fuller way of the social costs and social implications of criminal justice. So we need to somehow incorporate this third aspect of critique into the regular, in as much as we want to have criminal justice. But if we assume that, we need to somehow incorporate it into the system and think about the ways in which people are paying prices for this that are not acknowledged by the system, and try to start to acknowledge them materially or socially. Okay. So maybe there's more to say, but and then with regard to Lanzmann, Godal, Huberman, I just feel that this is beyond my disciplinary. I could make this into a much larger piece and then discuss all these things, but at this point in time, I think I need to still try to focus on the contribution to jurisprudence, to legal theory, that I want to bring here, and I don't know if I can allow myself to expand to all
But
the
you have
other.
to say something about where according to your critique, Eichmann should be tried, whether you're choosing the third,
So I
the
said,
arena of cinema or of screen.
Yeah.
Is there
Ultimately,
according to your understanding of law, that we have to take to Eichmann to try?
no. As I said, I think ultimately, I actually side with the idea that he should have been tried here, and ultimately,
Ben Gurion, you're siding with Ben Gurion.
I'm siding with Ben Gurion, but I think Ben Gurion didn't think about the social costs, and I'm siding with a more radical left-wing version of Ben Gurion. Yeah. Anyone else? We can also just maybe we're done.
Anna, what is the Greek perspective? Costa Gavaris.
Greek perspective.
I don't think you need to bring a
It's,
Greek.
So
you know,
maybe
the
say
debate is
something
so-
about the perpetuators,
Okay.
if you have time.
Yes, now it seems like I do have like 7
Okay.
minutes or
So you have
something.
7 minutes to talk about the new law of perpetuators.
Yes.
Who's going to trial us?
I think it's a very misleading point of view to think that justice can be carried out without the political context of power. If you want to have criminal justice is only possible within a condition in which you can assert political power. And the question that you're asking is, who will try those criminals who have the political power at this point in time? And the answer to that, I think, maybe disappointing to you, is no one. They will not be judged, and because thinking that they will be judged is trying to imagine a tribunal that is carried out by God, a tribunal where the only
Maybe by the machine.
the what
By the machines.
the criminal justice.
By
I insist.
The IBM, by the
But they're
with the
programmed by
computer.
people. The machines are programmed by
Maybe with
Not
machines
so
we won't
much.
need criminal justice anymore at all. That's a different question. But as long as we have criminal justice in this sense, forget about it. You will not have criminal justice that is disconnected from political power. Political power is the condition for criminal justice. And if you think otherwise, you're deluding yourself. You're deluding the people. That oftentimes we think otherwise. I'm including myself in this camp. And especially in the human rights movement, we think that we have this idea that we're fighting against impunity. So that's the idea that the world over, every crime will have accountability attached to it. But that's too many times that's an attempt to disconnect between the idea of justice and the actual practice of justice that ultimately does demand political power. So if you want to have yourself tried, my advice to you is to try to fight for the political power of your opponents. Really, because they will be the ones that will. No, I mean, I'm joking, but there is a measure of seriousness here.
No, but then the contradiction, the political power can judge Eichmann.
Cannot.
Cannot, because Eichmann is not a part of the political power of Israeli state. So who will try Eichmann?
I think that's not empirically correct. I think Eichmann was tried thanks to the political power the Jews were able to assert around the world in a particular moment. So it is related to the victory of the Zionist movement, of course.
Well, the Mossad.
Absolutely.
It's not the Jews, it's the Israelis.
Israelis, absolutely. Absolutely. The
It's
Zionist
not a Jewish conspiracy, it's Israeli conspiracy.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
It's all minimalistic.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that completely. It's
Although the Jews in the diaspora.
One have to
were
remember that Hannah Arendt herself, she's a German Jew. She's from the milieu of the same group of, probably I think the generation of Landau and Wittgenstein and others. And it's in a sense very much a family thing that came out to the public. So So this is also a very interesting angle. I don't know about Feldman.
No.
No, Hangman is younger. Younger generation.
Yeah.
Deborah?
So I have a question. When you read your third genre, besides the tongue-in-cheek, if the judge would be the executioner, how do you deal with this depersonalization of justice?
I don't know. With regard to Yali's first question, I had in mind to discuss. Yali said, as a judge, if I was in a position of a judge or even an assistant to a judge, I'm also paying a price.
Right.
And this, I had the opportunity to discuss this paper with a group of lawyers, some of whom work in a prosecutor's office, and they raised the issue of secondary trauma. They said, as prosecutors, I suffer secondary trauma. I have to deal with all these crimes. I read all the testimonies. I see all the evidence, and I live with this night and day, and it seeps into my personal life. It destroys my personal life because I read all these things every day, all day. And so I think that, and that I think it goes with what Yali said. It's just further evidence of his position or the point that he raised. And I think that the right way to deal with it, this person said that in the prosecutor's office in Tel Aviv, they started to have a psychologist who discusses these issues with the prosecutors to help them deal with secondary trauma. So I think that, and also the things that I showed from this group, Penal Reform International. So I think it's about paying people better. It's about attending to their psychological needs, and it's about not punishing people too much. So in the end, it's just really a kind of modest position in a way, but that's the position.
There's a technique at the IDC on psychological law. I forget what they call it. Anyway, it's a combination of the two.
Two concluding remarks.
Okay, go ahead.
First, a story, which is interesting in the context of your talk. When I clerked for Barak, it was in the midst of writing this very, very important precedent of wrongful life. So it was a very difficult case. Of a child who was born totally defective, and the question was whether you can sue for that. And after he finished writing, and we talked about it, a day afterwards, I asked him, "So what do you think about sites?" I knew that they appeared in court. And he said, "Oh, what?" He was totally disconnected from emotionally. He even didn't remember the name because he was so focused on the legal analysis, exactly the opposite of all the arguments here, which says things maybe for him and also against him.
It says things personally about him in any case.
He is detached from any, maybe now it's for political, but in his writing, he was in his judicial office, he was totally detached from emotions, persons, powers, and he thought only on the legal analysis, which is interesting. But I want to invite you to continue this project and to connect it to our center. We are talking about all the time the rule of law under extreme conditions, referring to the norms, the substance of norms, the change of norms, and we haven't never discussed really enforcement and legal processes under extreme conditions. And I think this is, we can argue, of course, whether this is extreme conditions or what constitutes and so forth. But I think that the issue of enforcement and legal process under extreme conditions is one thing that a missing link in our agenda. So this is an invitation.
Okay. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.
That's correct.
No?
Right?
No, no.